I'm doing my best not to giggle like a school child talking about today's subject, and it's very difficult. We'll just cover it. Sex. Hi, I'm Marcus, and I'm the idiot on the writer's block. Obviously, in certain stories, you might need to talk about sex, consummation, sexual intercourse, fornication, adultery? Look, I gave up writing the script for this particular episode because I was giggling like an 8-year-old, okay? So I'm just freestyling this, to see how it goes. I mean, take this idiot, for example. The edits on this particular video are enormous. I can't stop laughing, talking about sex in this fictional construct as it is. How am I going to be responsible enough to write a classy, romantic, or erotic sexual scene in a novel? Not that the novel that I'm writing has one, but we'll talk about that another time. How am I to be trusted to write a sex scene that the readers are going to enjoy without getting fed up at the fact that I keep putting juvenile penis jokes in there? So that's the question that we're putting on the writer's block today. How do you write a great sex scene in a novel? Here are some more mature experts giving tips on how to write a great sex scene.
Wow, it depends on, I guess, what you're trying to convey. Are you trying to convey it as a sensory experience? You know what I mean? So like every single aspect, like physicality, smell, what does the room smell like? What do their bodies smell like? Taste, what the skin tastes like. So all those little details, try to like incorporate it in and make it, I would say, try to make it as sensory as possible, because then you really get, a full experience out of it. Or sometimes it's not like that. Sometimes it might be that it's really rushed, as it can be, and maybe that's what you want to convey. So it might be quick, it might be fleeting, but you still want it to strike the reader. You still want it to have this robustness to it. So I think that's what I try to do with my sex scenes, is like trying to have this sort of full-bodied experience, even if it's quite short. So that's what I try to do. I find it quite odd that there is this sort of, I don't know if I could call it sneering, but there is this sort of reluctance to write about sex in literary novels. Like, especially in the UK, people seem to shy away from that, and I find that quite odd, because we all have sex, we're all human beings, there's nothing wrong with it.
I don't know that I've found many writers who do sex scenes right to my liking. I think, I guess I could define it in terms of what I don't like, or stuff, examples I've seen that I haven't really appreciated. I think a writer who I don't get on well with a lot is Sarah J. Maas, because I think she's kind of known in the young adult community as a very steamy writer. But personally, I've always kind of found her sex scenes sort of excessive. Not so much that they're graphic, but they just sort of seem in the way of like other important developments that are happening. So I guess a sex scene that maybe doesn't serve a purpose and is only there for titillation, I guess I kind of find a bit annoying at times. Sometimes it's a very fine line, because I know another sex scene I read recently, which was slightly, I don't know, slightly, I don't know if too graphic is the phrase. It was graphic in such a way that I wasn't into it. I was just sort of like, oh, that's kind of I like sex scenes as much as any other person, but this is not, these sorts of details, I don't find them, pleasurable to read about. It was in Nevernight by Jake Kristoff. So so that was how I felt about that. I think so. Sex scenes, I think, need to have an emotional function, or that's what I prefer. Yeah, I think there needs to be primarily an emotional drive behind them, and I think every man who's trying to write a sex scene should consult a woman first. Yeah, because I think I think that there's also a reverse issue recently with women who write about gay male characters too, right? Because we're sort of imagining this from our own sort of fetishized perspective in a lot of situations, and we're not really considering what that situation would be like between those sorts of characters, because that's not our perspective. So I think I don't know if research is even the right word. Just kind of, there has to be some way of putting yourself in the shoes of characters, of those characters who maybe like aren't, that you don't represent, and actually consider what that experience is actually like. Because I think it goes both ways. Like, women not understanding what like a male perspective would be. And men not understanding what women anatomy would enable them to feel, and also, of course, anything in between, male and female.
When it comes to reading, for me, I don't really read a lot of romance books, but I know even just in regular books, the scenes that can come up and stuff. So I kind of like where if it's integral like to the plot of the story, like I don't mind if it's there. I personally don't really like too much detail. Like I forget, I was talking about my friends with this one time, and she was saying, you can lead me to the room, but I don't need to know what goes on in there. And I'm like, yeah, that's perfect, because like I am not someone who's into reading, like, I don't know if people call it like smut or like those kinds of scenes, but I know like they're gonna, like, some people are into that, so it's gonna come up in books and stuff, and it is gonna come up in certain plots and be necessary. But for the most part, like, I just prefer not to have every detail when it comes to those scenes.
Well, I love this piece of string. Okay, so I'm going to avoid the question slightly and say it really depends on your genre. Okay, so if you write in young adult, then you are not going to have explicit sex scenes. So you're not going to have scenes that talk about vaginas and penises. Okay, you are going to have scenes that talk about the emotion behind the sex or whatever's happening. The chances are it will probably fade to grey. There may be some discussion of penetration or whatever, but you are not going to have language that really refers to like the intimate details of genitalia, essentially. So that's one differentiation. Is for young adults, it's much more about the emotion, the feelings, the sensualness. So there'll be a lot of description around touch and sensation and what that feels like to them. If you're writing adult, whether it be romance or whatever, and there's a sex scene, then you are going to have more language that's slightly more crass. You are probably going to have more description of the actual act of sex, and it's going to be a lot more around the doing and the physical sensations than it is necessarily about the emotional sensations. And then again, but I suspect there will be a lot of mix. So like in Murdering Magicians, I'm definitely using a mix. So I'm using both, the act and the emotion behind that. Whereas if you write erotica, then it's almost entirely on the physicality of sex. So there's going to be, all of those beautiful words like moist and juices or whatever, dicks and vaginas and tits, so it's going to be all of that good stuff. So yeah, like the best thing I can say to you is to actively go out and look for sex scenes in your genre and look at where they draw that line, and allow that to guide you.
Yeah, and I struggle with this too. I have a couple, like one serious adult author, and my others go between adult and like children's, right? So I struggle with this because in my heart, like I'm very much, like the young adult middle grade agent, and switching back and forth between like the romance world and children's is always a struggle for me. It's like you have to flip a switch and suddenly like sex is what sells. And then you have to flip back and you're like, we don't talk about that. That's taboo. You know what I mean? So it's very like, I struggle with it a lot too, but I get it and I understand. So, even on social media, like it's hard being both a children's agent and an adult romance agent because you have to talk about both. So yeah, but honestly, so what works in a sex scene, so you need to be able to have a purpose for sex. And I know it's weird to say that because in reality, like, we don't. So in reality, like, we all have sex because we want to have sex, and that's just it. But when you get down to it, so most of the, like, adult romance readers, or any kind of like erotica and things like that, so are women, right? And so, or are decently emotional beings. Okay, so we want to have emotion fulfilled with sex. So it needs to have a purpose. Your characters like can't just be, rolling up in bed next to each other and just like falling asleep and then all of a sudden go at it, right? So, or like if they're in an argument and they're like not happy with each other and they haven't talked to each other in 2 days, like they're not just gonna be like, let's go, let's solve this now, let's have some sex. Like, that's not how life really works in that sense. Like, I'd be angry, I'd be pissed off, like I'd throw you off me. That's not gonna happen, right? So So it needs to have a purpose, and it needs to be emotionally connected to your character. So it's accessible for everyone. The emotion there is honestly really important because, for the most part, like, people have sex as much as they want. It could be every day, it could be every week, every month, every year. I don't know, whatever floats your boat, maybe not at all, who knows? So, but the fact of the matter is that you only have a certain amount of sex scenes to really get across the emotion that's happening and the growth with your characters in a book. So normally, for an adult romance, it's like a medium heat. So you can probably do anything from, like 3 to 6 sex scenes maybe. And I'm like, 6 is actually pretty high for me. Like, I usually go a little lower. So I'm usually like 3 to 4 in a book is probably good. Because they don't actually, it's not like your characters are talking during this. They're not forwarding their growth and their progress throughout the movie. I don't know, who knows? Maybe they are. I have no idea. So, but if it's not erotica, they need to have a purpose, and it needs to, in some way, shape, or form, forward their movement as a couple and as a growth. And in order for everyone to feel connected to it, that emotional component has to be there. So sex scenes that both are like internalized in a way, and emotional to your characters are what are going to allow your readers to connect. So, we as readers are very escapist and very emotional people. So a lot of times when life doesn't go well for me, like, where do I go? I go books. So we want the romantic story that we may have never had, or we want the fantasy story that, we'll never get in our real life. And it's not that we want anything different from our life necessarily, but we need something that's not here physically right now. So a lot of it, I met my boyfriend on Bumble. Great story, like, end of story. That's it. Like, there's nothing else to it. So we want the really romantic, sweeping type of story that has all the emotions that, as like a couple of, 5-10 years, we don't feel that every day anymore. And books help us to feel that way. So when you have a sex scene that both connects you emotionally, so as well as physically there, so you want a little bit of descriptors, a lot of emotions, a lot of internalizations. Why are they doing this? How is this forwarding the character growth as a couple, and helping to like unite them in some way, shape, or form, solve a problem, anything of that sort. It needs to have a purpose. So otherwise, I'm like, you also want to have an emotional component because, not everyone is as attached to sex as others. So some are more attached to sex, some are less attached to sex. Like, if you want to appeal to the masses, there's a lot of people who aren't as attached, but they're more attached to the emotional growth there. So any kind of, like even ace people. So if they are not as into sex, I'm like, they may still get for the emotions. There's a lot of ace people who still love the romance, but just don't want the sex. So, and that's fine. And I'm like, but that's where you kind of want to appeal to all of your readers. and not just a select few. So making sure you have a really deep internal emotional connection there and are going back and forth between the emotions and the physicalities. And also avoiding the really overused and overdramatic adjectives in sex scenes is not needed. And I cringe all the time when I'm reading sex scenes that are just overly, it's awful. Like, it's not needed. You take it out. Like, there's nothing else to say there. Like, I don't know. Like, there's not even examples that come to mind except for, just avoid. I'm going to say this, but it's going to be bad. Avoid, like, what's his name? Christian Grey and the 50 Shades of Grey. Like, you do not need to be descriptive like that. And like, it's going to be bad because I've never read it, because my mother read it before I did, and that was not something I wanted to read. But honestly, like, you don't need to be that descriptive. You want it to be an emotional journey. So avoid the adjectives and the like extra adjectives, I should say, and just make sure you're connecting it to your characters as much as possible.
And there you have it. Experts who are far more mature than this idiot giving us tips on how to write a great sex scene in our novel. You can look in the description for links to their work. But what do you think about their suggestions? Do you agree or disagree with their takes on how to write a great sex scene? Do you have tips of your own that you would like to share with me? That sounds wrong. Do you have tips of your own that you would like to share with me as to how you would write a sex scene in your novel? Or if you would like to share some examples of spectacular sex scenes written in various books, put all of those in the comments to this video. And if you enjoyed the merriment that I certainly had making this, give us a like and subscribe to this channel to get more great tips on how to write, publish, and promote your fiction novel. I'm Marcus, and I'll see you next time. Finally got through that video. All I can picture right now is Jake Peralta from Brooklyn Nine-Nine jumping out and saying, "We finally got through it. Title of your sex tape, 9-9."